Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. In this video, I'm beginning the completion of the Introduction to Methods of Qualitative Research. For the remainder of the series, I'll be looking at Judith Butler's work and looking at the application of Butler's work to qualitative methods. It's not that I will be exclusively assessing her work with respect to feminist interpretations or with respect to feminist applications, though obviously I would do an injustice to her work were I not to integrate feminist discourse into the overall qualitative research paradigm. But the idea is to extend beyond feminist research, feminist studies, so that we can have a broader application, a broader conceptualization of the impact of Butler's work as it both informs feminist methodologies and also extends far, far beyond that. Again, like I did with the other theorist, the idea is to take the central concepts generally articulated and apply it to qualitative methodologies, and we will conclude this lecture series with Butler's work. Now granted, we probably still have another 4 or 5, maybe not as much as 6, but we probably have still around 4 or 5 hours worth of lecture, all of which will be devoted to Butler's work, and this begins on section 1.9 of my notes, as you know, or you don't if you don't. Click the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. Download the PDF. Use it to supplement your reading, and we are on page 23 of my notes. This is section 1.9. And with that, let's begin. So this is Intro to Methods of Qual Research. And this is section 1.9. Okay, so I only have 2 markers left. So I hope I have enough. Let me just check really quick. I might have another one in my bag. In case I run out of ink. Nope, I think that's all I got. Yeah. There might be some more in the office, but I'll look later. Okay, so let's begin. So we're going to be looking at bodies that matter. Much to my shame, I just recently started reading it. I haven't read it in its totality, but I am probably in the next month or two, probably by February of next year, March of next year, somewhere around that time, I'll read the entirety of Bodies That Matter. I know it's one of her first texts. It's dated, but it's amazing. I read it in preparation, a portion of it for preparation for this lecture series, and I fell in love with Butler's mind and her work. So I definitely want to have a better understanding of how she thinks and how she processes the world and information, how she sees things. I think you get that best from lectures, certainly, but you really get to know a thinker's mind from how he or she writes, right? What's in the text, because they have time to deliberate. You can be methodical, word selection is important, sentence structure is important, it's no sort of freestyling, ad-libbing. And I was very, very impressed with her stuff, and I will be consuming her work next year heavily. I might even do, possibly, I might do a series on some of Butler's stuff. I have to be careful because a lot of these scholars are still alive, and it's one thing to do Derrida or to do Kant, and they can't critique your interpretation of their work. It's another thing to do scholars' work who are still alive, and they can probably, call you and be like, hey, I didn't like what you said on this video about my thing, you completely misunderstood it. But interpretation is not the privy of any author, so we all are subject to interpretation. But I hope this does her work justice, because I'm terribly impressed with her mind. So, Bodies That Matter, Argumentative Overview. So this is basically just an overview. Okay, so the first thing, post-structuralists, right, dissolve of matter into linguistic practices. The idea, and this you're going to see sort of this debate, it's a very gradual process how this unfolds, but the idea is we have initially a very materialistic understanding of the world, right? And the way in which we come to comprehend this materialistic understanding of the world is through structural discourses, right? It's almost wedded to an idealistic metaphysics, if you will. It's very a rigorous interpretation of existence as ontically understood and accessible via matter. I don't want to compare what's happening in Butler's work to Berkeley, because I'm sure she would not like that comparison, but there is a sense in which there is, at least theoretically, some kinship between at least the structural approach of the critique against structuralism and Berkeley's critique of empiricism. So that the idea, or not, of rationalism. So that in terms of, so just a quick background, some of you, like, know ghetto philosophy. We're, 17, 18 hours into the lecture series, so I apologize if you're not familiar with these philosophical traditions. You can look them up quickly and get some sort of insight. But you have Descartes, Leibniz, you have Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, right? Leibniz knows of Descartes, I forget the chronological order, but you have those three rationalists, right? And then the rationalists are set in juxtaposition, sort of in contrast to the empiricists, which Locke, Berkeley, Hume. Berkeley being sort of the most contentious of all the empiricists, right? And the rationalists believed that everything was reducible to the mind, as a gross generalization, and the empiricists argued against that reduction and said that everything is reducible to matter, stuff in the world, empirically verifiable stuff. You can think of Berkeley's discourse, his critique against the rationalists and all the structures that they built. This is a critique against Leibniz's modernology. This is a critique against Spinoza's pantheism. This is a critique against Descartes' cogito and his evil genie, the Malgenet. Berkeley does a very interesting thing, an extremely interesting thing, which to this day has not been addressed. He says, in Critique Against the Rationalists, that if you look at all that the rationalists posit, if you look at the external world, if you look at anything around you, everything around you is reducible to sense perception, right? So that the color red is reducible to sense perception. That objects in the world are reducible to how we see them. Even critiques some of the conceptions of primary and secondary qualities, arguing that everything is effectively secondary qualities. No primary qualities exist as such. That is all interpretive. It all filters through the human subjective body. And what ends up, and that's important. That's important. It all filters through everything, all of reality, filters through the embodiment of the perceiver. Key point. Taking some note that Butler's book is Bodies That Matter, right? So it might be a bit of a philosophical stretch to compare, because Berkeley is seen as a bit, intellectually stimulating, but sort of impractical. G.E. Moore says, I know I have a freaking right hand because I have a damn, and I'm holding up my left hand, of course. I know I have a right hand because I have a damn right hand. Sort of in response and frustration to a Berkeleyan subjective idealism. And I'm not saying that Butler makes the same move, but what Butler does is she puts primacy, and this is important, right? She puts primacy on the body, but not just the body, the relationship of what we use this body for, the articulation of facts, the positing of propositions, the interpretation of our lived experience. All of this is filtered through the body and transmitted via language. So you can see that post-structuralists dissolve, they denigrate, I mean it's a harsh word, but they denigrate the fixed, structured, ordered, organized material world. And in place of this denigrated, in place of this fixed, structured world view, sort of structuralist worldview, they replace it with language and with the flexibility and the malleability and the arbitrariness and the meaning assignment and semiotics of language, right? And this paradigm is still to this day one of the most dominant paradigms in sort of intellectual thought. It still is very, very sort of prominent. Now, if you want a better understanding of sort of structuralism and post-structuralism and all that, just type in Geertje Spivak into my search field, not into YouTube search field, but my search field specifically. And I did a, I don't know, maybe an hour, half an hour to hour discussion on Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? And I give what I think is a fairly good articulation of, I think I do both structuralism and post-structuralism. Maybe in another lecture series I'll systematically sort of break down the structuralist point of view and the major thinkers and the major concepts, the post-structuralist arguments and positions and such. But it would, I mean, that's a 20-hour lecture to just really talk about number one. But I think what I've done, assuming that you understand the rationalist empiricist debate of, you know, the beginning of the modern era of philosophy, then you'll have some sense of not her affinity to Bishop George Berkeley, but the similarity in her attack against the established sort of paradigm. Her attack is going to be one of the most brilliant attacks I've seen recently, to be honest with you. So number two, the sex specificity of the female body was bolstered by its materiality. The sex specificity of the female body was bolstered by its materiality. I'm going to do a super quick, because it's so super obvious, but we have the identification of maleness, we have female, we have the man, and then we have the woman. Obviously, sex is S-E-X. Our sex is male and female, and our gender is man and woman, right? I mean, this is like intro to feminist theory, super 101. I'm not going to spend any more time on that because it's sort of obvious and sort of basic by now. You should know this at this point in your matriculation. We identify ourselves as male, and that's our sex, penis, balls, pardon my French. We have XY chromosome for all practical purposes. We have female as XX, vagina, ovaries, boobs. That's sort of the basics, right? But our gender is assigned based on that sex, and our gender is socially constructed. And, you know, I'm not going to get into the social construction of gender because it doesn't really apply here, but just to sort of situate sort of our understanding. So that when we talk about the sex specificity of the female body, it's bolstered by the old paradigm, right? By the structuralist paradigm. The structuralist paradigm, the structuralist understanding of the body, and the primacy that's placed on the physical embodiment, the representation of gender in sex. That's important, right? The representation, because gender is represented. The representation of gender in sex is something that is integral to a structuralist understanding of our embodiment, and thus the division between the sexes. Men on one side, women on the other side. Should be clear. None of that should be super complicated. Number three, its materiality served as the basis for feminist theory. So in a structuralist worldview, you can think about the primacy placed on matter, on stuff, right? So emphasis is really, and I should use red, emphasis is really placed on the embodiment, but the embodiment, rather than it reflecting our gender, the embodiment was a validation of our sex. That's very important, right? For the structuralist standpoint, in terms of feminist theory, the embodiment of the man, his gender, was less about the man and more about the representation of his sex, right? It's a biological distinction. You can see, there goes the genitalia, there go the physical characteristics, the phenotypic characteristics, which identify him as male and her as female. I can see it. Feminist theory is built on this structural demarcation, so that traditional feminist theory begins, evolves, emerges out of this structuralist understanding, structuralist interpretation of our sex-gender identification, right? And our sex-gender identification is like space-time, right? It's one and the same thing. It's impossible to talk about gender independent to sex. It's impossible to talk about sex independent to gender. When you evoke sex, you evoke gender. When you evoke gender, you evoke sex. So our sex-gender identification, and that sex-gender identification for traditional feminists' account, was rooted in the body of the person, right? So far this seems like, what's the problem with that, right? The traditionalist feminist account put primacy on the embodiment of the subject, recognize that subjective identity is largely conferred by the sex-gender identification, the relationship between, not the relationship, but I guess it is a relationship, the necessary relationship, or the essentialist, if you want to be technical, the essentialist relationship between sex gender. So traditional feminism has its root in this. Since you recognize that, I say quote-unquote, traditional feminists or structuralist approach, structuralist discourses on feminists, hold primacy to materiality, and thus the body, and you look at number one and we say post-structuralists dissolve matter into linguistic practices, you recognize that Butler must be situated just immediately. You recognize that her, and this is genius, her theoretical paradigm isn't denial of the structuralist, i.e. materialist articulation of gender identification, that it is a post-structuralist. It has a recognition of the materiality of the body, but there needs to be an articulation of the power of our linguistic discourse, the power of social construction, the power of the way in which language formalizes our thought and thus transforms our interpretive experience. And she does this super phenomenally. I hope I do her analysis justice, because it's dense. Her writing is like, she's like Spivak in that regard. It's extremely dense. It's not sort of easy to parse through her concepts, but I think this should be clear, right? So just recap super quick. Structuralist account emphasize the materiality. A post-structuralist account transfer the emphasis from materiality to linguistic practices, semiotics, or linguistic community. Feminism has its root, traditional feminism has its, first wave feminism and all the discourses that go along with it, has its root in this articulation of sex-gender identification. The body is emphasized, genitalia not necessarily emphasized, but we signify gender in our sex, and our sex serves as the basis for representing gender, and this is precisely what's being challenged, right? Now, it might not seem novel because there's so many years of social constructionist theory that we've had since the publication of this book, and I think it was 96, maybe 96, 94, something like that, when she published this book. I forget the reference to the date, but it was a while ago. I was just coming out of high school. And of course now we have so much hindsight, but imagine being Butler in that era, really at the vanguard, challenging, you're talking about a few generations worth of structuralist theory. She was up against a behemoth of academic prowess, and I think she did very, very well. So top of page 24. So number 4, top of page 24. Since the post-structuralist disillusion of matter, right? Since the post-structuralist disillusion of matter challenged the nature of materiality, it challenged the foundation of feminist theory. This is exactly what I just finished discussing for the last 5 minutes, right? So number 4 really is a logical relationship between number 3 on the previous page and number 1. Structuralist account emphasized materiality, post-structuralist critique that emphasis. Since post-structuralists critique that emphasis, and since feminist theory was grounded in, it began and it established its foundations in the materiality of our sex via the representation of our gender, you recognize that anyone assuming a post-structuralist feminist critique, and this is key, this is super key, anyone assuming a post-structuralist feminist critique is challenging the materiality, the primacy of the materiality of sex. Why is sex so important? Why are we placing so much emphasis on sex? And you'll be surprised where she takes this. She jumps off the super, super deep end of the pool. She goes way deep. She goes back to Plato and just, it's going to be beautiful. It's just a fabulous, fabulous critique. So I haven't given enough to answer why, but just take a mental note of why are we putting so much emphasis on the materiality of sex? Is a question that we need to answer. I approached my own interpretation of this answer, independent to having really fully appreciated Butler's work. I had known a little bit of her stuff. I read smaller articles she had published when I was undergrad and grad. Hadn't read her main stuff, which is what I'm going to do for next year. And I talked similarly, not nearly as intellectually stimulating or dense as she has, about the same challenge on sex in an article that I published with one of my friends on transsexual identification. Something also rubbed me the wrong way about the materiality of sex and the emphasis that we place socially on the materiality of sex, sort of the fixedness, if you will, the inflexibility of sex, and the emphasis that we place, and I use transsexual embodiment as a means of challenging that. Butler, takes it way deeper and challenges the entire theoretical paradigm. And I think she might have collapsed it personally. She did a hammer to the glass wall and basically destroyed everything as a good philosopher should do. And then she built her own. So number 5, the category, so it should be clear what's happening here, I hope. And forgive me if this is going a little too fast, but, you know, this is 17 hours in. I don't want to belabor the points either. Number 5, the category of sex is always re-inscribed as gender. So the category of sex, right, sex here, is always re-inscribed as gender, right? Sex is the vehicle with which we represent gender. Or you can say gender is represented through sex. They mean exactly the same thing, right? So sex is the means with which we represent gender, or gender is represented through sex. They mean propositionally exactly the same thing. And she is challenging this relational dichotomous nature of this relationship between sex and gender in a whole new sort of way. So the category of sex is always reinscribed as gender. Thus, the post-structuralist dissolution of matter challenged the social construction of gender by challenging the materiality of sex. That's me having written that. I think it's a good sentence actually, but I hope that makes sense, right? The category of sex is always reinscribed as gender. So when we talk, we don't talk about sex, we talk about gender. Thus, the post-structuralist dissolution of matter, sort of the post-structuralist theoretical argument against structuralism, challenges the social construction of gender. This is as representation, gender as representation. Representation of what? Representation of sex, right? So that if you really, it's like the Matrix. The Matrix is gender, and the real world is sex. So we are falsifying our discourse when, in a sort of radical sense, when we talk about gender, because really at the heart of what's informing our thinking, what's informing our speech, it boils down to biology. And the inability to acknowledge that the biology is informing the thing that we've socially constructed arbitrarily is what's at stake here, right? There's a representation as though it were synonymous, right? As though sex was gender, gender was sex, rather than saying sex is a representation, or gender is a representation of sex. Sex is the means with which we represent gender, rather than saying that. Okay, so qualitative application. Graduate students should consider the emphasis placed on both language and matter in the social construction of any and freaking basically everything, and I'll explain that in a little bit. Is this all there is to social constructionism? Is there something else informing our ability to construct? If so, what? If not, why? Very, very dense question. It's not user-friendly question, so I'll explain this without going into too much detail. So you have basically a Hegelian dialectic, right? So you have a dialectics. And the dialectics begin with a thesis. So you posit an initial thesis. And your thesis is X, right? So you posit a thesis, and your thesis is X. The original thesis in this line of sort of philosophical inquiry pertains to, obviously, structuralism. So, if you were writing a PhD dissertation on this topic via Judith Butler, a substantial part, I'd say a third of your literature review should fully and accurately articulate the structuralist position. The structuralist position is the original thesis. What you're going to see rises to the surface in terms of the key theoretical concepts espoused in structuralism is the primacy placed on matter. Obviously, you know, you're thinking post-Enlightenment era, emphasis placed on Enlightenment theory, primacy of scientific community and scientific knowledge, and thus every other intellectual paradigm falls in line. I mean, you have to fall in line. Scientists proved what they set out to prove, thus there really isn't any argument. Of course, there will be, you know, radical members of any community, mystical segments of the community that will seek to challenge it, or faith-based that have nothing to do with it. But since intellect and academia isn't faith-based or mystical, since academia is established as a science, we, academics, fall in line to the governing precepts of science, obviously. So it's not to say that structuralism was wrong, it's just to say that structuralism fervently, almost wholesale, assumed very scientific scientific sort of predispositions to their socially scientific research. And there are problems with this, right? So the antithesis to this, it's not a biconditional, the antithesis to this is post-structuralism. So the original thesis is structuralism. The antithesis to this is post-structuralism. Butler's work is going to be primarily rooted, I don't know if she would label herself as a post-structuralist, forgive me, Judith Butler, if you ever get around to watching my videos, if you don't quite label yourself a post-structuralist, but her approach is certainly a post-structuralist approach. I don't know if she herself identifies herself as a post-structuralist, she probably forgoes labels, but this critique, Embodies That Matter, is clearly a post-structuralist critique. What I'm asking you to do is to do the next level, which I don't know that I've seen yet, which is the new synthesis, which is a combination of the original structuralist thesis and the antithetical post-structuralist thesis into something new. And I'm asking you, graduate students, name that thing. If it's already, forgive me if I don't really know what this is, and I don't know what it might be. I know of a few disciplines that might fit this category, but not with respect to the materiality and the primacy of sort of matter. I don't know anyone who's done that. Why? Because, for example, to return just briefly to the beginning of contemporary philosophy, rationalists were the initial thesis, right? The empiricists were the antithesis, and then German idealism via Kant, Immanuel Kant's categorical imperatives and ethics, his synthetic a priori, in his canonical text, Critique of Priori Reason, synthesized both the rationalist POV and the empiricist POV in what's known as the Copernican Revolution. The Copernican Revolution is the hybridization of both the best of rationalism and the best of empiricism, formalized within his basically transcendental aesthetics. And it's one of the most genius things ever. Logically speaking, it's also incredibly, and there's a deontological logic to it, which would be interesting to formalize. The logic is super consistent and really, really dense. It would be fun. Maybe I might challenge some uber logic nerds to, maybe I might do that for next year, like do a deontic analysis of Kantian logic. But his logic is impeccable in that as well. The synthesis is, yeah, Butler's here. We're the next generation. Like, what do we have to say about this emphasis, right? What do we have to say about the position? Granted, you don't understand fully this yet, because I haven't explained any of it. I'm giving you the overarching broad paradigm. I'm giving you a visual representation you can put in your notes so that you can conceptualize this, right? Okay, original thesis was structuralism. Butler's critique is basically an antithetical to that. I get it. Emphasis more on language, less on materiality. But are they wrong? Is it both a little bit of language and materiality? Is there a dialectical relationship between materiality and language that I could conceptualize, that I could articulate, especially given advances in contemporary science? As I said, we social scientists have to take our cues from science. We have to take you're not doing this right if you're not taking your cues from science. So I recognize, and trust me, I'm in the middle of this with my editors and my publishers, but I'm like, you know, if in Australia they gave someone a synthetic eyeball, completely manufactured, artificial, and the individual can see based on that eyeball, and it's real now, it's no longer sci-fi, our philosophies, our articulation of our subjective identification needs to embrace sort of android functionality. We have to start writing about and talking about very seriously synthetic parts and consciousness, and it's no longer that sci-fi stuff. It's always difficult to be on the vanguard where you're at the precipice of change and transformation. But as our forefathers and foremothers did before us, as Butler did before us, taking note from the latest, greatest scientific insights, we have to incorporate the most modern discoveries in science into our, we have to, it's not open for discussion. Change your discipline if you don't want to do this, right? We have to incorporate proven factual scientific discoveries in our understanding of this social nexus. So this next wave might be able to talk about a combination between matter and language because, for example, and I'll throw out a little goodie, because, for example, we now have technology that allows me to think and manipulate the world. That technology is proven, it's factual, some of it is ready for sort of consumer consumption. I'm sure there's military grade stuff that's just mind-boggling. Oh my goodness, can you imagine? But this technology exists, so that there is a sense in which our language is different now, right? Our language might even be becoming material, right? Sort of the materiality of our language might even be conceptually possible now, right? And we might have some new hybridized, bizarre semantics of materialized linguistics, blah, blah, blah. Who knows what's going to be on the... But push the boundaries, right? Push the boundaries. Don't keep regurgitating the same stuff. Butler didn't get to where she was because she regurgitated the same stuff. Understand Butler, appreciate Butler, and step beyond her. She would want that. I would want that, right? Step beyond her. But you can't do that if you don't understand. So this is the sort of the framework, the theoretical framework for which we're going to do this. I think that makes more sense of my question now. Is this all there is to social constructionism? The answer is obviously no. Is there something else informing our abilities to construct? That's this. If so, what? What might that be? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis of both. Okay, so let's move on. My board. I need a new eraser. I'm gonna, after this lecture, go buy a new eraser and markers. All right, so the matrix of power and heteronormativity. Right, the matrix of power and heteronormativity. All right, so number one, here's the assumption. Deconstructionist critique of materiality potentially challenges the inherency of sex. Sex is biological referent. The deconstructivist critique of materiality, thus, i.e., a structuralist traditional position, challenges the inherency of sex, right? The matter, biological embodiment of sex, as the referent for our gender, right? So if I say man in language, man is X. This word man refers to that, right? So the gender in our language refers to the sex. Now, deconstructionist critique of materiality potentially challenges the inherency of sex as biological referent, which is arguably essential for all feminist reference. Let me read this part and then I'll get back to what I just wrote because this is actually really important. So, qualitative application. The biological referent here is very specific. Namely, white, male, Protestant, heterosexual. I'll talk about that in a second. A good content analysis research project might be to assess the genealogy of this referent and the possible chronology of each aspect of its formalization. For example, when did male assume its importance? White, Protestant, heterosexual. What is the role of violence in normativization, etc.? So I jumped ahead a little bit there. So let me take a step back and make sense of this. So in our language, I say man is X, or better yet, I would say Jason is a man. Let's say that. Jason is a man, period. Okay, so Jason, me, obviously, is a man. Sort of I talked about the ontic existence and is, the to be. Jason exists, and basically what this is saying is Jason exists as a man. Okay, my existence as a man, in our language, man refers to the gender. We know that that gender points to the biology. The genius aspect of, this is superficial right now, this is very superficial right now, but just so that you understand, what we recognize in a potentially, we haven't fully formalized it yet, but an emerging post-structuralist critique is the assumption that our language refers to the actual sex. Does my language, does the evocation of the word man in language really refer to my genitalia? sort of weird to be lecturing about my own genitalia, but does the evocation of the word man really refer to my genitalia? Without me obviously evoking my genitalia, right? It's bizarre. You got to take one for education, right? No, in a sense, it really does it, right? In terms of semiotics, and this is a fact, in terms of semiotics, the evocation of the term man in semiotics, and you have to watch my semiotics lecture in order to fully appreciate this, man is the word or the utterance, so it goes underneath, and man refers to a concept, man. This is like the Berkeleyan move, right? When I see an apple and I bite into the apple and I see the apple is red, red refers to me, secondary quality. The taste refers to me. The touch of it refers to me. Everything about this apple, according to Berkeley, refers back to me. Thus, without, you don't want to make the claim, without me there is no apple. Why? Because Berkeley has to posit what's known as isius percepi. To be is to be perceived, or perception is contingent on, existence is contingent on perception, and he posits the all-seeing God, right? The all-seeing God keeps all of this in order, which is profoundly deep, and no one's been able to sort of critique that. They just sort of walk away from Berkeley. I think there's some absolute genius in his subjective idealistic turn. What I want you to see, and this is very dense, and I apologize if this might be too dense, but, you know, Butler, this is me making Butler user-friendly. This is me making Butler, this is Butler with a smile, because it's even denser than this when you read her, but I love dense work, right? And I love to write like that and read that stuff. So hopefully I'm doing her justice, because it's really hard stuff to sort of conceptualize and understand. You have to know the history of Western philosophy to make sense of all of this. But the idea is, when I say Jason is a man, the structuralist assumption is actually, we can sense now, I'm giving you a little bit, I'm going substantially deeper, but the structuralist assumption is that the word man actually refers to my genitalia. Without me ever evoking, hey, Jason is the type of human being that has genitalia XYZ, dot, 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 dot. No. When I say Jason is a man, man as the utterance, as the word in my signification, refers to the concept man. Thus, nothing here is biological. Not the word is biological, nor is the concept biological. This is key. This is the key to post-structuralism in its totality. If you can understand this move, you understand post-structuralism. The assumption is that when I say tree, that tree refers to the thing tree. Rather than saying when I say tree, tree refers to the image of the thing, and thus the concept, or it is the word tree. So the image of the thing or the word, and that refers to the concept. Thus it's all socially constructed. There is no biological here, right? So a huge distinction. The hairline or razor-thin distinction is within an alternative account of the ultimate referent of our language. If the referent of our language is in the world, or if the referent of our language is more complex concepts, you have your essentially your demarcation. It's profoundly more deep than that, but this is already deep, right? So that Jason is a man in the sentence as evoked by gender, as used as a word in any language, you can translate that word into any language, always refers to the concept man, never to sort of, stuff. Okay, so I think we should be able to understand now this really nuanced distinction, and it's more complicated than this. It's profoundly more complicated than that. But I think initially now you should start to see, oh, okay, I can see how this would work. You should be thinking, okay, we're talking really about, in demarcating structuralism from post-structuralism, the way in which the referent is identified. If the reference is identified in the world empirically, then roughly speaking, we have a more structuralist approach. If the reference is conceptual and contingent within our language, the structures of our language and our semantics, then we have a post-structuralist. The point is, if you are interested in both, why not do a combination? Why not say, no, things refer, and this is how you would do it. I'm really giving quite a bit away here, but I don't mind because I'm not going to do it myself. No, and I think I agree with this position myself. It's a little bit of both. Our language both refers to the world and language itself, such that it's because of the mind independency of the world, right? The mind independency. No rational theorist, no rational scientist is going to say that with my death all of this evaporates. No, this is not a product of my mind. This stuff exists independent to me. Thus, there is a mind-independent existence, right? The preservation of which you can debate how it's preserved or not, but it exists independent to me, as always already. When I exist, when I become, and I become aware, I participate in the existence of reality, right? I become part of this material world, and thus my language becomes part of this world. And I can't get into the structures of all of that. Ideological determination is important. Modern research in, I think it was Harvard, where, and I'll just a quick sideway just to prove this point. Modern research in Harvard, and I was doing research on this before I even heard about what they were doing at Harvard, but they had radiology students, or maybe professional radiologists, doing oncological, what do you call it? Oncology, yeah, I guess oncological scans. And they had, like, you know, the thing, they're looking for cancer stuff, blah, 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 and sort of superimposed over the x-ray or whatever the devices that they read, that sort of plastic stuff that they read, I don't know what it, I'm not sure if it's an x-ray, superimposed is an action figure. So they superimpose an action figure over, let's say, the x-ray. So you're looking at an x-ray, and an untrained person is like, wow, there's clearly an action figure superimposed over your x-ray. The oncologists, or the radiological oncologists, whoever, were, I think it was like 80% or 90% never detected the action figure. Why? Because they were trained not to look for that. What are they looking for? They're looking for cancer cells. They're looking for some abnormalities. How does that relate to the potential synthesis between language and materiality? Well, it's because they were trained. Their training was done in language. Hey, you're a fledgling radio oncologist. When you look for stuff, look for this, and this is how this looks, and make sure you look at that, and these things here, and a professor did just like I'm doing with you. Talk. They understood, they asked questions, got clarifications, until their brain created really new neural networking that saved all of that information, such that when they're presented with the information, they don't have to, they're no longer learning, they immediately process. Their brain just, their wiring is done. There's no thinking about it, they know what to look for. That's anomalous. It's not anomalous, that's not part of what I'm looking for, so I discard it. The materiality of the world, that is the x-ray, is informed by their training, language, their training as completely totalized within, and there is no debate about this, this is a fact. Their training, their learning, their education, their ability to do this is wholly a consequence of language. Thus, the world, the x-ray, what they're looking at is imbued with their language. Now this is weird because when I look at it, I see that. Why? I don't have the same language that they have. The mastery that they have over language informs their participation with the material world in a way that my language does not inform my participation with the material world. And this is why you have individual human beings who can do exceptional stuff. Because they've trained themselves, they've learned to think in a new way, and they can see things that you and I can't otherwise see. And I really mean that. And they can fail to see things that you and I can obviously see. So that there might be a new possibility on the horizon for new interpretations that transcend both structuralist and post-structuralist positions. And I know it's really deep, but I think, and it might be a little bit out there, but I want you to, as a qualitative researcher, try and push the boundary of what we're thinking about, what we're discussing. So, let's read. I'm not going to draw this image. So, at the very bottom, theoretical basis for feminism on left hand, and this is the structuralist standpoint. So, the materiality, physical, of the female body prior to post-structuralism. An emphasis is placed on the actual body. So I have a little picture of a stick figure. All those lines are the emphasis, and the emphasis is placed on the body. Then we move to the material physical reference is displaced because of the post-structuralist critique and what is put in place of the material body, just as I've been saying for the past 45 minutes, language. Threat to the existing theoretical basis, post-structuralism, threat to the referent. So let me explain this just one last time so that it's clear. In the proposition, Jason is a man, this proposition has truth functionality. You recognize that this proposition is true. Why is this proposition true? The old interpretation of the truth of this proposition is contingent on the verification of my maleness. So you do a blood test, or you look and you're like, yeah, he's clearly a man. The post-structuralist interpretation is far more complex than that because of any number of scientific discoveries which say there is a spectrum of manness. So you can't just say it's X, Y, because you have any number of chromosomal genetic anomalies where the individual is identified as a man and is in fact a man, but don't have the same genetic code as other men. Thus, you can't just make this reductivist account that it's XY and that's it. Why? Because there's so many counterexamples to that. So then you say, well, no, then it's biological. It's about what you have on the outside. But we recognize because of intersex identities that you can't say that it's about biology either. Why? Because there are times in which the individual is clearly identified as a man, but unbeknownst to you, the individual may be intersexed, and that's yet another counterexample to the assumption. Thus, gender, what's known as gender essentialism, male-female, is collapsed, and the post-structuralist account is you're placing emphasis on the body, and that emphasis is misappropriated. The appropriate place to place emphasis are in the context and the semantics of our language, and it's the way in which what we say refers to concepts that informs our interpretation of things. Thus, when you say Jason is a man, it's not to deny the biology, but you're talking about something different. What is it that you mean when you mean man? When you say man, what does that mean? And this is the new paradigm. The attempt now that we have this demarcation is to make sense of what do we mean when we say man. We know that man refers to the concept. This whole thing becomes the signification. And that sign, if you will, as the conflation of both, that sign becomes conceptual, undeniably. It's conceptual. And it's subject to arbitrariness, it's subject to social interpretation and social manipulation, social transposition of meaning and such. It's completely flexible, such that the idea of man now isn't as rigorously defined and as regimented as before, and there is some flexibility. Why is this flexibility important for social activism? Why is this flexibility important for progress in society? It's important because once we recognize a flexibility in our concepts, we can subtly alter our concepts ever so gradually to account for social transformation, such that it's hopefully more inclusive. If you're doing an exclusionary ideology, you make it more rigidified, you make it more sedentary, regimented, rigidified. Rigidified might actually be a word. You make it more sedentary, you make it more regimented, so that it excludes others. But the idea is the malleability of our ideas, the malleability of our concepts allows the subtlest shifts such that over time we have a preservation of the concept. But if you look historically at, here's a perfect example, the idea of homosexuality. In the Greeks, homosexual practice, I guess, was practiced, but it didn't have the same pejorative concept that it does or did in the, the 50s, 60s, 70s, right? Any number of other practices were practices as well that have perverse sort of social implications now. The power of social construction is that we can effectively change anything into anything else if given enough time and the receptivity of the audience, which is why the argument that Santa Claus is white is laughable. Santa is white because we want him to be right now. If we collectively wanted to change Santa's race, we'd change his race like that. It wouldn't be in a decade, it might be maybe 40, 50 years, but we could, because of social construction, the flexibility of the concepts, rather than it being rooted in some biological fact, means that we take control and ownership of the concepts and evolve the concepts into anything we want. which is precisely why, I give you something like this. Now, you gotta wait 17 hours to get it, you know. Some of you will have just looked and come to Judith Butler and skipped everything else. Shame, shame, you should have gone through the 17 hours. No, I'm teasing. But, I mean, her insight is super deep, right? So it's a conceptual shift. Okay, so before I go to page 25, top of page 25, I'm going to pause, and then I'll come back and we'll continue with number 2 at the top of page 25. Okay, so top of page 25 of my notes, number 2, the power discourse informing heteronormativity, I'll explain this in a second, sex, male, female, gender, man, woman, what I just described, well, I'll talk about the norm in a bit, was grounded in the materiality of sexed bodies. So let me stop there. So when we talk about this idea now of, so this is an idea, H-E-T-E-R-O, obviously heterosexual, normativity, N-O-R-M-A-T-I-V-I-T-Y. The idea of heteronormativity is to make a norm out of heterosexuality, which is obvious. There's no need to describe that, right? So heterosexuality becomes the norm. Everything else is a deviation from that norm, right? So LGBTI, complete deviation. Heteronormativity also includes stuff like transsexualism, cross-dressing. Anything, it gets very, I mean, the complexity of heteronormativity, even color identification, especially in the States. Boys wear blue, girls wear pink. A boy that wears pink, something suspect about that boy. A girl who wears blue, something suspect about that girl. Right? So the idea is, and you know, I'm not going to go even into sort of biblical interpretations of this, but it's very, very entrenched within not only our social norms, but our religious norms, that gender identification means not only you look a certain way, not only you practice a certain type of sex, but the clothes that you wear have to conform in a certain manner. The way that you groom yourself has to conform in a certain manner. And this, again, both socially and religiously, the implications are to reinforce heteronormativity. What ends up happening as a consequence of this? Well, I mean, the consequences are obvious, right? If you're a man who likes to cross-dress, but you are heterosexual, you just like to put on girl stuff, you're perverse. There's something deranged about you. There's something wrong with you as a man. I think, you know, as all good things in the world, some people might disagree with me on this, and I have to sort of be careful how I go, because I know that this is a big religious sort of point of view, and I'm not trying to defame people's religion in any sense. I'm really not. But the idea is, you know, cinema and Hollywood and television and movies and music help our society become more inclusive. My kids, my daughter loves Miss Doubtfire. She loves, it's like one of her favorite movies. And what is the whole point of this? This is like pre-Medea and pre all of this, and I think it was post Tootsie too. But the idea is, there's a man who's dressing up like a woman. And the idea is that changes social norms. That changes the way in which we see the world. So my kids watch this now. You can imagine trying to show that movie in the 40s. Oh my goodness, the director probably would have been killed for trying to even shoot a movie like that, right? There's no way you were going to get that production up and running, much less have it become the success it became. Much less have young children watch this. Now, if children or just adults in the world see, I mean, it's very rare that I see it. I can't, maybe once in my life, maybe once in my life I might have come across, I've seen quite a few transsexuals, but I think maybe once in my life I might have come across public cross-dressing. It's very rare that I even see that. It's still very anomalous that you see it. With heterosexual man dressed as a woman usually happens in private, but if it happens publicly, oh well, still no, there's something wrong. Why? Because this guy's an attention seeker, this girl's an attention seeker. Probably less so with women, but with men still very, very taboo. Why? Because our norms tell us that when you see that, there's something deviant about that, right? You can imagine a 6'2" muscular guy with a beard, wearing a little dress and stockings and heels and a little top. What a freak show! What is going on? Is there something going on? Is there a parade going on that I don't know about? Like, why is this Like, you couldn't just go to the mall like that. You know, this guy might be his life might be in danger for just walking out the house like that, not harming anyone. Why? Because these norms are still in place. It is a profound, and like psychologists would have to do a social psychology of these norms, but just the sight of someone like that might incite others to harm this person for no other purpose than it's a violation of what they assumed to be everyday sort of norms. It is what it is. It's more powerful than I can even understand. I understand it, but I can't, even now, lecturing, I'm like, I just can't understand that. Yeah, I can't understand why it's that powerful, but it is. So wherein discourse was then generalized, universalized by reference to absolute biological referent male, the social construction is human, emphasis on man, and woe man, obviously the minus, woe, the detraction, the minus, the less of man, with the linguistic referent he as universal. Like, there was a time before gender neutrality in our language that we say the universality of masculine identity. So we talk about humanity, or not humanity, we talk about mankind. We talk about he as universally neutral, gender neutral. But she is gender specific. This is obviously changed in my writing and in my students' writing. Pick a gender and sort of alternate your genders, right? Make sure you don't do disagreements in numbers and make singular gender identification plural, but you can go all plural, you can go select a gender, you know, you cannot have gender reference, but the idea is at least to be aware of this. So in terms of a qualitative application, tracking the academic, primarily feminist movement to de-genderize our language, how has this changed in our use of language? How has it aided women's rights movement? What is the difference? What is the significance of that fact? And I think the obvious point is it's significant because the attempt to universalize masculine identity as representative of all identity, it marginalizes women's identification, right? It marginalizes a part of feminism that's known as difference feminism, which is, listen, let's not all say that we're the same. Let's say and acknowledge the fact that we are in fact different, but with respect to our difference, rather than diminishing one group and demonizing and marginalizing the importance of one group, acknowledge that we are in fact different, right? And use that as a mode of bolstering diversity and bolstering inclusion. The idea is the way in which we speak, how we speak. If you're aware of this while you're writing, you won't marginalize 50% of your audience, right? So Butler now says the following. This is number 3. Materiality is bound up with signification from the start. I love that. Materiality, and she uses the proper, I love that. Materiality is bound up with signification. This is signification. This is signification. Right? This is our sign. This is signification. Right? The signification is the consolidation of the reference and the concept. It's a consolidation of the word and the meaning and the idea behind the word. It's all of that within our language. So she's saying, and this is exactly what I said, when we talk about our biology, she's saying our biology isn't an end-all, be-all in some structuralist, antiquated sense. Our biology isn't the ultimate referent, the final, fundamental referent for our language. No. Materiality is bound up with signification. To talk about the material world is to talk about the material world, right? So to end with the material world as though that were the end of the discussion is to fail to understand how our language informs the material world, right? And this isn't to talk about, as Aristotle would call it, the thisness, that is the carbon-based arrangement of atoms and not that. That's what hard scientists do, right? They say this thing is identified as such, it has these constituent elements in this particular atomic relationship, and blah, 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 and they describe the structure. We're not interested in that. We're not interested in the atomic, subatomic, blah, blah, blah of the structure. That's not what social theorists are interested in. That's not what John and Jane Doe are interested in daily lives. Absolutely not. They're talking about a man. They're talking about a man. Hey, this guy, I met this guy at the I met this guy at the barbershop, and let me tell you what this guy was talking about. Da da da. You think John and Jane Doe care about genetics, and you think genetic discovery is going to inform John and Jane Doe's collective conduct in the world? No, it's not. It has no power over the masses. Science really doesn't. Oh my goodness, that's oh, who is that? That's Gasset. On the barbarism. I think it's barbarism or brutality. It just jumped in my head. Oh my goodness, I might have to tie that in. I think I could tie Butler and Gasset, Revolt of the Masses. But yeah, Gasset's absolutely right. Scientific insight has no discovery. It has no significance, really, over the masses. I mean, you have sort of niche, nerd-specific aspects, small communities of the masses that sort of understand and are interested in pop psychology, pop physics, pop philosophy, pop this and that. But the true insight, the understanding of how, the know-how of real scientific discovery, the stuff that keeps this world spinning day to day. I mean, you're talking about a very, very super micro tiny community of people who actually have the know-how. That community, what the social scientists do is we continually assess the findings of the scientific community and challenge the scientific community to validate what they've said. Is it really the case that by man you really just mean X, Y? Well, no, actually it's not just that, because there's okay, well, people, guess what? It's not just X, Y, right? You can be different types of men and da-da-da. So that by the time it gets to John and Jane Doe, we recognize man, woman, because that's simple to understand. This is not to demonize or to dehumanize or to discredit the intellect of the mass. But the idea is the mass is informed by social science. The way in which political campaigns are won, the way in which voters are swayed, the way in which social activism is launched, and inclusion and law and everything is facilitated on this planet is through this. In terms of technology and development, all of that is science, but there's two halves to this world. You have sort of the infrastructural technological bit, hard scientists and engineers take care of that. Then you have social governance, social science, and this is what we do. The idea is to understand, sort of know your role. And what she's saying is, listen, don't think that we, social scientists, have to, and the Sokol affair points to this geniusly, so just Google it if you don't know it. Look, stay in your lane, social scientists. We don't have to talk about the gravitational constant. We don't have to talk about the facts. We don't have to prove it because we don't know how to do it, really. You can parrot it, but you can't go in the lab and recreate it. And if you can't go in the lab and recreate it, then recognize that all you're doing is parroting it. But the idea is what we can do, what we ought to be doing, is to be thinking more complexly about our language, and our language is referring to itself. I'm not referring to genes when I talk about man. Who refers to genes when they're talking about man? Who's referring to chromosomal blah 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 when you're talking about man at the conversation at the dinner table? Nobody is. We're talking about the evocation of that term refers to language itself. So that even if you regard the biological referent in our use, the evocation of man identifies the body but refers back to itself. Right? The evocation of man, it identifies the body, but it refers back to itself as a concept. And the question is, what is that concept? And you'll see this concept becomes patriarchal. This concept becomes, for other feminists, dominating, rigid, defined. Man means more than just... Now, it doesn't have to be sort of to debase men, and it's not man bashing. It's not that. But part of the concept of man is a recognition, just as is the case in race theory, that man is a privileged concept. Woman is a concept just like man, but there's more privilege, economic, social. There's more privilege in all of the institutions, in educational, in business, in political, in religious. There's more privilege in evoking man than there is woman. And the question is why? It's completely arbitrary. It's because men are in power. So that the concept man is more than just the biology. The concept man includes stuff like that. And we'll deconstruct that more later. So her point is, materiality is bound up with signification from the start. Right? So you can see a better a more sort of dense articulation of signification, just click the link here. So 3 aspects. This is the sociological importance of signification. So I want to talk about this importance, right? So the question is, what is the importance of signification? The first, right? The first is an epistemological condition for intelligibility. Signification allows us to think. The relationship between the words that we say and its reference to concepts, and simultaneously its reference to the world, serves as the condition in which we're even able to understand. And Immanuel Kant does this masterfully in his categories, his 12 categories. So I don't want to go and do a whole analysis of this now. If you're interested in having a better understanding of that, just type in David Hume in my search field and watch my, I think it's like 5, 6, maybe 8 videos on David Hume and Immanuel Kant's fork and the synthetic a priori. I'm not going to take the time to go into it now. It would take us on a huge tangent, but I'll give you sort of a consolidated discussion of this. Basically, what ends up happening is our body is built like a machine. Our body is a machine. It's like any other machine. And the more science advances, the more we recognize that a significant portion of our body is it's like electrical. It's exactly like a machine. We're just matter that processes electricity instead of, or we're just meat that processes electricity instead of, you know, freaking metal and plastic and electrodes and silicon chips and blah 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 that processes electricity. But we are meat processing electricity is what we really are. Okay, external world stimulus comes in. My body is built in such a way, it's designed, and I have to be, you can take 2 positions. It's either designed in such a way or it has evolved in such a way. Either one doesn't really matter to me. So if you want to take a design argument, it's designed in such a way. If you want to take an evolutionary argument, it's evolved in such a way, but it doesn't matter. So our body has either evolved or been designed in such a way that the external world of stimulus, our body processes this information in a very unique way. In terms of evolutionary, this is a consequence of millions of years of adaptation, millions of years of environmental immersion in which we recognize those conditions that lead to the thriving of the species, and we keep those attributes that are good for us, and we discard those attributes that are bad for us. And the discarded bits are the losers in the game of life. They don't get to pass on the gene pool. Okay, so that's the evolutionary bit. We obviously know the design argument, you know, creationism, all that other stuff. Not to discredit it, just both sides. I want to be objective and argue for both sides. Truth is, it doesn't matter what side you pick. The truth of the matter is, both sides have to agree that our bodies are such that it is built to process external information. And most of it now we are starting to recognize is, maybe all of it is, well, no, there's pharmacological. It's electrical and pharmacological, right? It's sort of, you know, enzymes and secretions and pharmacology and sort of electrical impulses and discharges and such. So those 2 things make up who we are. Okay. You can imagine if I were to attempt to take a DVD player and put the DVD player in a toaster and watch my movie. I know this sounds absurd. It's supposed to sound absurd. And take my DVD, not player, but the DVD disc, and put it in the toaster, and I drop the toaster down, attempting to watch the DVD, it's not going to work. Why? Because the toaster wasn't designed to read the information on the DVD. It's not the function of the toaster. Now, I have to stay away from teleology and the scientific community. I get that. But this is a general articulation. What our body does is our body is built to transmit information and receive information as part of who we are and how we process bits. The first thing that we recognize is that I come to understand, I come to make sense of my world. Why? Because everything that I know, or could even, any and everything that I know, everything that I could even conceive of, comes to me through my body. So that the body becomes, right? The body becomes the vehicle for knowledge. And a really gross representation of this is we have external stimuli. And the truth of this is that modern science is proving this unequivocally. Like I said, there is a functional synthetic eye that somebody has in their head, where a fake eye, where their real eyeball has gone, and they can see through, like this exists in the real world, right? Completely manufactured, artificial, synthetic eyeball in somebody's head, functioning like a real eye. So now it's no longer theory, it's fact, it's scientific fact. This is no longer sci-fi. You just need to know what the function, you need the how. How does the eye function? The eye functions by this, the optic nerve does that, connected to this nerve, blah, 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 invert the thing, blah, blah, blah. I mean, of course, I'm making this super simple. We can reproduce all of that functionality in a created synthetic eyeball, pop it in the head. Can you see? Yes. What do you see? Wow, they validated it. Sure. So there's no question that this is fact. So Kant was absolutely ahead of his time, because he's right. So the external stimuli goes through our body. Our body has a series of functioning and processes. It's the way in which our body is wired, more and less complex. Once we understand the functioning of all the different bits of our body, we could, in theory, actually have completely, and I believe that we will, have, this is bizarre to say this, completely synthetic life. Completely. I believe that. And what ends up happening from that? The book doesn't stop here. It's not just about the body. It's a recognition that that information that we have now processed via our body, we articulate it through language. Right? So that when we talk about the body, and this is what Butler's saying, and I'll read her quote from before, this is number 3 in the middle of page 25, materiality is bound up with signification from the start. It's impossible for you to talk about matter without using language, without making sense of the world from a community of linguistic speakers. This is exactly the same problem Descartes had, but Descartes thought everything was reducible to I, when he recognized that the I was also sociolinguistically informed. Similarly, it's impossible to talk just about the body without recognizing that the body is already filled with meaning, filled with signification, filled with complex concepts. And the idea is the scientists and the social scientists, the best game that we can play is the social scientists posit a problem, they posit a conundrum, they posit just a theoretical abstraction, and scientists try to get it done. That's a really good idea. I wonder if we really could pull that off. I don't know. That's a great concept. Let me see if I can assess based on some abstract concept, right? Granted, their work is really hard, but their work is at least informed by the recognition that we are able to conceive something, and insofar as that conception and that conceptualization is possible rather than contradictory or impossible, then it's just a matter of how do we go about actualizing that possibility. It's a matter of how. And once we figure out how, it's done. But we can never figure out how without first articulating the concept. And that's what we do, right? Social scientists, if you're doing your job well, don't feel bad that we don't understand how in many instances. That's not our job. In some instances it is. Our job is to be able to formalize and legitimize the concept. And this is what Butler's doing, which I think is absolutely genius. So the condition for generalization, that is the formal rather than material. For example, chairness, this is a bit more abstract. So the idea is we're talking not about just one individual instance of a thing, like this woman, or this chair, or this man, or that computer. What we're talking about is the ability to participate in the form of, right? We will see later that, rightfully so, Butler identifies this form as Platonic and thus completely dismantles everything in a rather genius insight. This might not make sense now, so if you don't understand that, don't worry about it. For those of you who are more advanced in your understanding, you'll get her move. Her move is an anti-Platonic discourse. Aristotle's conceptualization of form is a materialist conception of form, so it wouldn't be affected by Butler's critique. Butler is specifically giving an anti-Platonic critique of form. Thus, this has immediate reference to Plato, which is why in the coming sections, I know because I've prepared this, in the coming sections she's specifically going to pinpoint Plato. But the idea to participate in form means that we're talking about not just an individual body that has this sex, or an individual body that has this sex, and I didn't mean to write one on top of the other, so, right? An individual body that has either of these sexes. What's at stake here is the recognition that all individuals of this type, the type being the form, will be labeled as such. Thus, materiality is already bound up with signification. It's already bound up with the form. This is a representation of all others, such that I don't have to go around and say man, woman, man, woman, man, woman, man, woman, man, woman, man, woman. Look at woman, look at man. Here are the essentialists, right? Here are the essentializing characteristics. Here are the essential characteristics of her type, his type. We generalize from these types, right? So her argument is that materiality is already bound up with signification, but there's problems with the assumption that everything rests in materiality for all of the counterexamples that I gave before. So that we recognize emphasis must be placed on language and not biology, and not to say not biology, but emphasis must be placed more so, maybe, on language. I would say in a contemporary account, we might want to revisit the biology with language and do some type of hybridized account. And right after this, I'll talk about qualitative application. So, next is the means of conceptualizing essence. I don't really want to get into that per se, but the materialist account, as I said, is an essentialist account. The materialist account says man is X, woman is Y, right? Or, man is, one form, woman is a different form. The characteristics and typology for man is identified as da-da-da-da-da. Characteristics and typology for woman is identified as da-da-da-da-da. There is an inherent problem in that essentialist POV. Why? Transsexuality. Why? Linguistic communities' ability to construct new identifications based on transformations in theory, transformations in language, SRS surgery, genetic engineering, any number of things, right? So that we need flexibility, and that flexibility then undermines the essentialist sort of dichotomy, this binary sort of discourse of man versus woman. Okay, so qualitative application, beyond the sex, beyond biology, beyond the sex, beyond biology, where does the concept man and woman refer? We should understand the answer to that now. You should know the answer to that now. Right? Where does the concept man and woman refer? It refers to language itself. It refers to the way in which our language gives us an ability to understand and to conceptualize meaning, but it's more than just our embodiment. Man also refers to structures of power. Woman, in reference to those structures of power, you have to recognize that man is a more privileged concept than woman. Right? It seems like, oh, well, how did you make that move? Why is that such a leap? Well, I mean, I could justify that any number of ways, but I'm going to ask you to just be obvious and to be, when you have political movements that seek to have women, I think it's a Lilly Ledbetter Act where, women's rights to get equal pay for men. Why would we even need to have a movement for that? It should already be the case. Just like African Americans argue for white privilege, women argue for masculine privilege. So despite the fact that I'm a minority, I'm a man. And insofar as I'm a man, oh, well, he's a man. So you can recognize on this sort of social construction hierarchical critique, the bottom, unfortunately, the bottom, the most displaced would be a minority woman. And then you can say a minority sort of lesbian woman, right? The minority lesbian woman is almost subaltern, right? And doing qualitative studies on her and her community, you can sort of compound marginalizations, sort of the difficulty in representation and the difficulty in identification at a national level, at a political level, at the international level is really, really difficult. But I've seen trends and changes in our society to suggest that all of this in the next couple of years is going to change. We will always have emerging problems. We will always have new conflicts to resolve. But at least some of the old conflicts we will have moved past a bit. So these conceptions are inherently socio-culturally constructed, so one must account for cultural relativism. These are going to, the idea of what man is and what man means in one culture is going to be different from what man is and what man means in another culture. You cannot argue for the rightness of interpretation with respect to masculinity or femininity, male identity or female identity, as being universally true. Well, that's the problem of social relativism. No, other cultures have different interpretive accounts, and the idea is to gauge how the conceptualization of man and woman as gender identification informs social practice. That's key. How does the conceptualization of man-woman in terms of gender identification inform social practice? Where social practice discriminates against women, abuses women, dehumanizes women, violates women, then obviously we need to and I said this earlier with respect to you can see this sort of reoccurring paradigm. Then we need more inclusive conceptualizations of women. We need more inclusive accounts of women's rights, women's roles, women's responsibilities, women's contributions. Why? Because as simple as it sounds, as I said, we're not doing hard science here, as simple as it sounds as, you just need an educational movement for women's inclusion. Like, what is that going to do? It's going to change the world. It's exactly what it's going to do. You fight one generation for 20, 25 years, the next generation, everybody looks at it as normal. Of course women can do this. Of course women can do that. Why aren't they doing this? Right? But the idea is, obviously this becomes a power dialectic. Those in power may or may not want that challenge to their existing power through women's liberation, women's movements. And this is the whole basis for first and second wave feminism. We're arguably now into third wave feminism. There's some contention in that account. But once women have the rights, once women can express themselves, it's then about the equality of women's livelihoods in every manner. And the fight is a fight for inclusion and equity. And that's still an emerging process, undeniably so. So what are the socio-cultural similarities and differences? The notion of strength is an example of the connotation of male-man identification. So that the idea is, and as a matter of fact, I heard this on NPR the other day, a really interesting thing about the U.S. Marines, and women are coming into the Marines, and of course you have, it's a perfect argument. Part of sort of inclusion, to be part of active duty, you have to do 3 pull-ups, and overwhelmingly a lot of the women can't do the 3 pull-ups, and some men, of course it was a guy, and I'm not knocking the guy. The guy said, see, this is proof that women can't, they're not strong enough to be in active combat, so, women infantry is going to make us weak and, destabilize ground troops and blah, blah, blah. This is a bad look for America. And you listen to argument like, I don't know, if they can't do pull-ups, they got to pull themselves, they got to move around, how effective can they do? Then, of course, they bring the next guy on immediately after this guy and goes, I think he was a trainer. He's like, no, I'm a trainer. Like 12 weeks in the gym with me, and I can have basically any woman doing 12. And they have this woman on there, I can do 12 pull-ups, right? So the idea that it's inherent is absurd, right? The idea that, no, a woman is incapable of doing, I know this seems tangential, but this is so to the point. The idea that a woman is inherently incapable, or women, not a woman, but women as generalized, are inherently incapable of doing 3 pull-ups is completely fallacious. What it is, and I'm not arguing this to this guy, no disrespect to the dude, whoever he was, but sort of his position as a stance, this is against the norm. The norm is that men go to battle, that men fight our wars, and if we have women fighting on the front lines, our enemies might look at us as weak and as easy pickings. But you can recognize that if every woman that's out there has passed the 3 pull-up tests, and some of them are doing 12, there might be women out there that are stronger and more fit and more agile and more capable than some men. Right, so the idea is, why are we putting so much primacy on it? If we've created a system, you think of CrossFit, you think of, you know, sort of all the advances that we've made in training, and there's a desire in the individual, why ought she not to serve in that capacity? So it's challenging, and this is huge. You might not think it's huge, but to have inclusion at that level in what has, from the beginning of human civilization, been exclusively male-dominated is big, is really big. I don't think it's going to be tidied up overnight. I would imagine there's going to be substantial debate about this, and I think justifiably so. But at the end of the day, the fact that women have the desire and women are willing to transform their bodies to be able to, you know, complete whatever the prerequisites are, I think is a testament to just an enormous transformation in the population. Right? I think it's an enormous, and I think everybody will have their sort of conspiracy theories because men aren't doing this and women have to pull it. No, I think that in any time, blacks wanted to serve their country when they couldn't serve their country and fought for their right to serve their country. Women wanted to serve their country and weren't able to serve and fought for their right to serve their country. And, you know, for those who aren't patriotic, you'd never understand anyway. For those who are patriotic, then you know what it is to give your talents to the institution that you love. And the idea that the only reason why women are serving now is because men aren't doing it is absurd. No, women probably have always wanted to serve, but they have never had the voice to serve, and now they're willing to serve, and they're transforming their bodies so that they can serve, and serve aptly. And I think we should congratulate that, right? Who are we to say that, no, you don't really want to do that? It's social institutions of oppression why you're signing up and you don't really want to. How are we going to tell her what she really wants to do? She's signing up for the job. Clearly she wants to do it. Let's support her, right? Let's support her. So I think, you know, that idea of strength is going to change, right? It's not just physical strength now, and it would be horrible, so let's just already project. The critique would be, oh, look at these new Marine women, they're so masculine, they're so male. No, let's not do that. Let's just, for once in society, not be so damn predictable, and just recognize that there will be a class of women that serve in armed combat, and they will be just as beautiful, just as matronly, just as motherly, just as feminine as a woman who chooses not to serve, right? If anything, she'll be more diverse because she's both things. She's both a warrior and she's, you know, she's all those other things, right? I'll let her determine herself. But let's not be so quick to, you know, evoke and disenfranchise all of these differences with respect to this woman. She isn't really a woman. She's a creation. She's an abnormality of the institution of patriarchy. No, no. Talk to her. Anybody force you to serve? No, it's all voluntary. It's an all voluntary army. I signed up for the job. Do you mind that your body's changed? Actually, no, I don't. I think I look better. I feel better. I'm better equipped to serve. If she says that, that's the end of the discussion. Right? This is the end of the discussion. Who are we to tell her who she ought to be? If you argue she should be more feminine, you're imposing on her. If you say she's masculine, you're imposing on her. Let her speak for herself. So I'm very interested to see how this sort of unfolds in the U.S. on the national level, and you know, I think this will change. This will change quite a bit. And this has happened, like in Israel and such. Women serve openly. I think mandatory for in many countries. Women serve, so it's not a novelty. All right. So Butler, this is number 4. Butler is more interested in the genealogical construction of materiality. I did put key. She's more interested in the genealogical construction of materiality. What in the world does that mean? It means, sort of really quick, that we lived in a mystical age in the dark era, right? In the dark age, where everything was transcendental, where everything was informed by, you know, mysticism or mystical beliefs or transcendental beliefs. Not to disparage anybody's beliefs, And science came on the scene and said, no, we can make sense of this. I can account for how these phenomena occur. And scientists set out to do just that. And they proved that their paradigm was absolutely right. Because their paradigm was, and probably will always be, reproducible. Don't take my word for it. Reproduce my findings. Here's my recipe for how I found X. Take the recipe, cook it up yourself. Okay, so the reproducibility of science legitimizes it. It's no question legitimized legitimized function. What ends up happening? In terms of the construction of materiality, social construction of materiality, we see that the tendency in the social sciences, via parroting the sciences, not really doing hard science, but sort of perpetual parroting of science, we see that we overemphasize the material without an understanding and a true appreciation of how our language informs our understanding. Our job isn't to reconstruct this atom. Our job isn't to, bang these things together to create some new stuff. That's not our job. Our job is to understand how the discoveries of science inform our social practices. How is it that the discovery of pasteurization, irrespective of microbiology, irrespective of virology, irrespective of sort of chemical lysing and all this other stuff, irrespective of all the technical bits of how it works, the question isn't about reproducing scientific discoveries socially. No, the question is, what are the social implications of scientific discovery? Thus, our materiality, the stuff of science, isn't about, for society, the stuff of science, but how the stuff of science informs society. That's not something that the scientists do. They're not interested in how it informs science. That's what we do. So the question is, well, what does that mean? Well, it means, for example, this seems super trite, but it means, for example, that we might be more susceptible, I don't know if this to be a fact, but we might be more susceptible to bacterial contamination by an overuse of antibacterial stuff. So we wash our hands, there's antibacterial stuff everywhere. You go into any store, you come into a university, you go in a library, there's antibacterial stuff everywhere. So it's antibacterial stuff every 5 minutes. Where we recognize that antibacterial stuff is a consequence from sort of Pasteur's discoveries and everything else, and spontaneous generation. So it has materiality in science. The materiality of science led to products, and we use these products to kill germs. None of this would have been possible without sort of enlightenment discoveries. It's not about the fact that we use this to kill germs, which is what science does. The question that we're asking is, what does the use of this mean for us collectively? And what we might be able to conceptualize is, well, if there was a time at which we didn't use antibacterials and we were exposed to more germs, maybe that helped increase the diversity of germs in our GI tract, right? And maybe that increase in bacteria in our GI tract, because we didn't wash our hands, helped in the digestion of food. And thus maybe part of this is a stretch as hell, but hey, it's fun. This is scientific, social science research, exactly what I'm talking about. This is a stretch, this is a huge stretch, right? But I love this type of crap. Maybe the fact that we are cleaning our hands so much with antibacterial soap is decreasing the diversity of bacteria in our stomach, which is then increasing the amount of food that we ourselves digest that otherwise would be digested by bacteria, and thus are increasing weight gain. Thus, you could correlate antibacterial hand sanitizer to weight gain. Give me a shout out. You gotta give me some love for that. That was pretty damn good. That was amazing. The increase of antibacterial. It's absolutely genius. It's absolutely genius. I don't know if it's true. I posited it just now. Somebody takes a lab, they do the findings, it's probably less likely the case, but Dr. Campbell has a pretty interesting point. Let's run that test. Let's see if it's true. It could be. That's what social science does. That's what we ought to be doing. We shouldn't be talking about the chemical nature in which the antibacterial thing lyses the blah, blah, blah. That's not our job. Our job is to do what I just did. Take the discoveries of science, think about the social implications of these science, think about any network of interactions in our social relations, posit it back to the scientific community. Scientists, hey, I saw Jason's video. That was very interesting. I don't know. Maybe there is a very subtle relationship between antibacterial hand sanitizer and weight gain. I don't know. So if you want to lose weight, stop washing your hands. It's of course, I expect this, but you can see the correlation. There is probably a correlation. It's probably less likely. But that's the type of stuff that we do. Scientists then take that, make assessments, where our hunches, where our theories, where our theses have been validated and reproduced by science. New scientific materiality is posited, we apply that socially, we posit it to them, and back and forth 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 and back and forth, if we're doing this well. Right? Shout out to me for that, because that's pretty much gangster. So Butler's more interested in the genealogical construction of materiality rather than the irreducibility of its quote-unquote form, which is wholly contingent on its signification. That should all be clear now. So this is Butler, direct quote, against the claim that post-structuralism reduces all materiality to linguistic stuff, an argument is needed to show that to deconstruct matter is not to negate or do away with the usefulness of the term. To deconstruct matter is not to discard the term matter and the importance of matter. I just gave you a perfect example. Right? What we ought to do is be amazing critical thinkers. What we ought to do is be amazing logicians. What we ought to do is to think about invisible correlations that could possibly be informing instances in our social lives and our social practices, and make sense of those relationships. Are these relationships purely social rather? If they're purely social, account for them. Then we can do how. If they are informed heavily by science or completely dependent on science, then do what I just did and sort of posit it back in scientists, let scientists run tests to see what the likeliness and the likelihood of this correlation is. So it's important to understand that it's not to discredit per se matter as much as it is to shift the emphasis that we place on matter from purely material, sort of its material basis, and recognize that when we talk about matter, it's the implication, the social implication. That's key, right? It's the social implication of both matter and the materiality of scientific discovery. How these things affect, inform, influence, shape social interaction is what we do. That's our job. And I think it's unfortunate that most graduate students I've come across, both in this university and abroad, don't quite understand what our function is as social scientists. That's really what we do, right? That's why we're called social scientists, right? We have to take, and I said this before and I won't say it again because now I'm sort of beating a dead horse, but we have to take, which makes me think of Nietzsche, but we have to take the discoveries of science and make sense of these discoveries and talk about the implications, the projected, anticipated, predicated, if you will, discoveries of science and how it's going to transform our social relationships. So it's not wholly to discredit matter and the use of matter and the importance of matter as much as it is to understand the transformation of matter. Matter for the post-structuralist is transformed by a recognition that matter is itself informed. The transformation is a consequence of the way in which we inform our understanding of matter through language, right? And then qualitative application, how would you construct this argument, defend it, support it, etc.? I leave that for you to conceptualize on your own term. From this section, what I want you to grasp is Butler's attempt to shift the emphasis from a wholly materialistic discourse for the foundations of feminism to a new articulation of feminist movement and feminist critique of patriarchy and feminist understanding of subjective identity as intimately tied to language, semiotics, and the way in which our language refers and shapes the world. And that last part, the way in which our language shapes the world, needs to be emphasized hugely. And what I'll do in the next few sections is talk more about how that occurs, how our language shapes the world, shapes our epistemology, shapes our understanding. So stick around for the next few sections, after which point I'll wrap up the series. That sort of concludes this section. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. Have a good day.